he's also the little man, okay? And I don't mean that in a physical sense. He's kind of maybe a little bit below average height, but he's the person from a fairly humble background who kind of makes it, more than makes it, reaches the top. And I think that's an example to a lot of people afterwards, okay, after 1815, that you can achieve where your talents and I guess fate takes you. And it doesn't depend upon your birth. And I think that's kind of inspiring for a lot of people after 1815, and it's pretty new.
Dr. Michael Rowe is a reader in modern European history at King's College London, where he's been teaching since 2004, which is also the year when he was elected Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Over the last 2 decades, he has published extensively on the period of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. He's also delivered a brilliant series of podcast lectures on Napoleon for the Historical Association. Michael, welcome.
Thanks, Azza.
Before we dig into Napoleon's life and his deeds, and of course Ridley Scott's polarizing movie, I'd like us to address one thing. Literally 2 seconds after I first contacted you via email last week, the YouTube algorithm was immediately so kind as to serve me a debate between two Napoleon biographers, I believe Adam Zamoyski and Andrew Roberts, slugging it over the question whether Napoleon was great or not. Andrew Roberts said that Napoleon was not just a military genius, but that he was, I quote, enlightenment on horseback, while his opponent, Adam Zamoyski, said that he essentially ruined France's position in Europe and that the man was, I quote again, a prude who brought his small-town morality into public life. So I thought it would be interesting to begin the episode by asking you which side of this historical judgment you fall on.
Yeah,
Was
I mean,
Napoleon indeed great?
yeah, I mean, what's wrong with small town morality? um, yeah, I think he is great, and I think he's great because he's primarily a great institution builder. Okay, so I don't think he ruins France. In many ways, he kind of produces the France that we know today, with things like the civil code, with the administration, the whole kind of institutional edifice. Okay, things which are not going to be necessarily celebrated in a film, because who wants to see a film about bureaucrats kind of coming up with an administrative template? But yeah, that's a kind of legacy which Napoleon himself talks about when he's in exile. He's a great general. You know, he wins more battles than he loses. He loses the war overall, but he's also the little man. Okay, and I don't mean that in a physical sense. He's kind of maybe a little bit below average height, but he's the person from a fairly humble background who kind of makes it, more than makes it, reaches the top. And I think that's an example to a lot of people afterwards. Okay, after 1815, that you can achieve where your talents and I guess fate takes you, and it doesn't depend upon your birth. And I think that's kind of inspiring for a lot of people after 1815, and it's pretty new.
You begin your podcast lectures on Napoleon's rise to power by explaining that after the French Revolution of 1789, there was a sort of a vacuum. I believe you say that there was a demand for such a figure as Napoleon to appear. Does that mean that any sort of a strongman or a general taking over would have a similar trajectory? And it was more about timing
Hmm.
than anything else? Or did Napoleon possess a set of unique qualities that enabled him to set his meteoric rise in motion?
Yeah, I mean, I think France would have ended up with a Napoleon-like figure. Okay, and there are several contenders in the 1790s. Young generals, young kind of people who have made their career in the military. They're in their sort of like 20s, so way more junior than you'd expect a general to be. And you can look at these things in terms of supply and demand. Okay, kind of like economics, and there is a demand for a Napoleon kind of figure in late 1790s France, and there's a kind of an oversupply, and Napoleon kind of makes it. It's partly through luck. He himself believes in luck. He's a bit superstitious there. He's not entirely a man of the Enlightenment. He believes in luck, but he's also a great general. And there are other great generals. They're good at tactics, they're good at operations and strategy and logistics and inspiring their troops to follow them. He's good at that. I think what he brings possibly uniquely to the mix, he's a great self-publicist. He does his great actions, but then he also broadcasts about the great actions he's done, and he does some actions which aren't so great, like Egypt, where he essentially kind of loses, but he manages to spin that into a kind of great achievement. So he surrounds himself with publicists and artists and so on. So he's very good at propaganda, and I think that is maybe that combination. Okay, you're demanding a hero. You need a talented general, but you also need somebody that kind of convinces you that he's a great general. And Napoleon kind of ticks those boxes.
How did he market himself? I mean, what exactly did that even mean at the end of the 18th century?
Well, you need to make use of a printing press, and okay, the printing press is an old invention. It goes back much further than Napoleon, but it's becoming kind of cheaper to produce prints, and the population of France and indeed of Europe more widely is becoming more literate and is more able to kind of afford pamphlets, visual images. He patronizes great artists, people like Antoine Gros, who produces these wonderful kind of paintings of Napoleon, which maybe only a few people see, but then you get kind of like cheap kind of copies essentially, which are produced. So all of that, and he's very good at kind of language as well. He writes these kind of short, I guess you'd call them kind of pithy declarations, proclamations to his troops and to civilians. So he's a good communicator in that sense. He's not a great orator, I think, when it comes to actually speaking to people in an assembly. There he kind of falls down. But he's very good at kind of speaking to a wider audience through the use of what we would call the press.
Did he have an accent when he was speaking French? Like a Corsican accent?
He does have an accent, and his writing is kind of like full of, sort of spelling mistakes. Not that that sort of matters very much, because when you're important, you can kind of dictate things to secretaries, and they kind of tidy it up a little bit. Yeah, so I think his oratory skills are not brilliant, and that actually leads to sort of problems at one crucial moment when he does his coup d'état in 1799, and he kind of he appears before the assembly and tries to get them to basically vote themselves out of existence, and the oratory and all that is kind of completely awful, and basically has to call in the guards to clear the assembly, or his brother does anyway.
You said that he was making use of the printing press and newspapers.
Mm.
Was there a relative, how should I put it, freedom of press? How tolerant was he of criticism?
Well, he's not tolerant of criticism, but he is entering into a very vibrant kind of print culture in Paris. One of the things that the revolutionaries do, at least initially, is to basically get rid of kind of censorship laws. So you get a fairly free press, and then it sort of tightens up at various points. But yeah, he can make use of that kind of talent pool of journalists and publicists and printers, which have sort of come of age. And again, it's a supply and demand. These people need to sell. These are commercial kind of, commercial outfits. Okay, they need to sell news, and they need to sell their kind of prints, and so they need a hero as well. And Napoleon is great there.
What was some of his other undisputed talents? You mentioned that he was a great military strategist and that he was great at marketing and being a propagandist. Did he have like a good memory, or was he a charismatic person? Was it easy for him to attract followers?
Yeah, I think it is. He does seem to have that, and charisma is such a. It's kind of one of those
Elusive
very.
term,
Yeah, it's
right?
elusive. You know what? You don't have a tick box of 10 things, and then you're charismatic. He does seem to have that. You know, it's one of those things which is hard to recreate because we haven't got any film of him or recordings or see how he moves or those kind of things. So it's really you get it, I guess, indirectly as a historian and see what other people write and I guess how they act. And he does have this capacity to attract, really talented people around him, and that's interesting. That must count as one of those things where you say, yeah, he probably is kind of great because that must be a definition of great leadership. Yeah, I mean, he remembers the names of the ordinary soldiers. He will kind of make a point of greeting them, maybe tweaking their ear or their cheek in a kind of familiar kind of way on a parade and say, I kind of remember you, how you doing, kind of thing. That sort of personal touch. So he does that, but he also, and I find that interesting, manages to combine it with a degree of detachment. Okay, I do the familiar stuff, but I am nonetheless not you. I'm kind of separate. I'm this kind of great figure. So he's a bit of a stickler for things like kind of etiquette and
Protocol.
protocol. Yeah, yeah. He's not the kind of guy where he would really tolerate it, but you just go up to him and pat him on the back and say, hi, Napoleon, how you're doing. He can do that to you, but he will. He starts to behave a little bit monarchical even before he, kind of seizes power in France in 1799, and of course, as his regime then develops, he becomes ever more monarchical and kind of a stickler for sort of formality and protocol.
Do we have any anecdotes about what happens when people, don't treat him the way he expects to be treated, when they don't follow protocol? How does he react to these
I'm
situations?
not sure if there are any examples of that. Maybe they just don't dare. I assume they would be banished from court. It's not kind of like one of those regimes which would sort of simply kill somebody. He's not like a kind of the worst of tyrants that we're used to. But he will make comments. I mean, this comment you made about sort of prudishness at the beginning, this kind of it's Adam Zamoyski you're quoting there.
Yes.
He does kind of make comments if women at court are sort of maybe a bit underdressed or whatever and are revealing a bit too much. He'll sort of make comment, aren't you feeling the cold or something like that? Some kind of snide remark to embarrass them. So he's a little bit kind of conservative on those kind of things, and he wants things to be kind of correct and ordered. And he doesn't like public embarrassment or scandal. So I think there's a degree of care which needs to go into things like protocol to prevent some embarrassing moments where then people can possibly mock you. That he's not very good at taking. He won't sort of laugh at himself, and that's maybe not such a great quality of his.
We talked about how difficult it is to discern if he was charismatic or not in person. What do people who are maybe not French and met him say about meeting him?
Finding an objective source, of course, is difficult
Impossible, I
because
know.
people
Yeah.
have a kind of like strong views on Napoleon one way or the other. And I mean, I suppose one of the people that does know him best is a very interesting figure from this period, somebody called Metternich, Clemens von Metternich, who's the Austrian chancellor, foreign minister, basically in charge of Austria from 1809 onwards. But he's also ambassador to Paris in the years before that, and he meets. He has a lot of meetings with Napoleon, and probably the foreigner, I guess, who's probably had most interaction with Napoleon at a kind of professional level would be Metternich, and I think from what he writes, you get the sense that Napoleon is quite good at manipulating his interlocutor. He does this kind of passive aggressive type of thing, and you're not quite sure if
Interesting.
he's really angry and having a tantrum or whether it's just a bit of a kind of a show to pressurize you, and then he will turn on the charm. There's sort of stories about him kind of taking off his hat and throwing it on the floor and kind of stamping on it. And, he does these kind of things during negotiations. But is it something which is just a show? He puts it on and off like an actor. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think he can do charm. I mean, another interesting source is of a sort of correspondence of people like Marie Louise, the second empress, whom he marries in 1810, and in there he comes across actually as a very kind of a positive person, somebody who could be quite charming and have a degree of empathy for somebody who, like him, had been a foreigner essentially in France, and French elite society isn't always very accepting of foreigners. Indeed, it probably isn't most of the time. And he kind of eases her into that kind of life. So I think his personal characteristics are really very interesting. That they're really interesting because they're kind of to an extent contradictory.
All right, we gotta go to Napoleon the military man. If we look at the entirety of his military record, all the battles he ever participated in as a general, from spectacular wins such as Austerlitz to crushing defeats such as Waterloo, when all is said and done, was Napoleon an undeniably brilliant commander or not really? Or was he a bit overhyped?
Yeah, I mean, military people tend to sort of divide things up, okay, into what they would call strategy. So that's the overall kind of geopolitical picture, what you're trying to achieve, what is the big idea. And there, I think Napoleon does kind of fall down. I mean, I think he's not a great strategist, and I think his strategy is essentially aimed at defeating Britain using kind of economic warfare, blockading the entire continent, which means in a sense kind of subjecting to your will a vast number of other European powers, and that just seems to be kind of utterly unrealistic. Um, but I think at a lower level you've got what military people call about operations, moving armies around, on a battlefield and over a slightly bigger territory. And I think there Napoleon's absolutely brilliant. And you reference Austerlitz, and there's a battle actually just before Austerlitz, Ulm, which in many ways is even more interesting because it's not a particularly bloody operation, but he through moving troops, moving units of the larger French army, these subdivisions known as corps. He moves them all the way from the Channel coast down into southern Germany, and he uses speed. He plans, which routes they're going to take, and he essentially encircles the Austrians before they know what's hit them. And that's absolutely brilliant, and it's kind of studied, the Napoleonic operational art. It's studied in military academies, after the Napoleonic Wars as kind of this is near perfection. Some of it. This is what you need to try and aspire to as a military commander.
All right, you analyzed one of his biggest victories. What if you tell us what, for example, which flaws does one of his defeats expose of him as a military leader? Waterloo,
Yeah,
for example. Is
I
it
mean,
what you said about him that he's not a great strategist?
yeah, I think that's part of a problem. I mean, when you say spectacular defeats, I mean he has spectacular victories like Austerlitz and Ulm, but I don't think he has really spectacular defeats in a sense.
Hmm.
Even battles like Waterloo,
Yeah.
which he loses, are as Wellington says, is a close run thing. Napoleon isn't somehow suddenly surrounded and then sort of like loses the battle within an hour or so without pretty much firing a shot. So he doesn't have those kind of catastrophes. Yeah, looking at Waterloo, part of a problem is that he needs to, win that battle fast. It rains. It means you can't attack the British as soon as you want to. Um, I think there's also a problem that if you're good at anything, people will then start to sort of copy you. So a lot of his best victories are sort of earlier on. Austerlitz is fairly early on, I guess, 1805. But then if you look at his battles after that, you find that the Allied powers start to up their game.
Hmm.
And they become kind of harder opponents. They start to develop what we call the core system, the way you organize your army and subdivide it. I think his enemies start to become actually better motivated, especially the Prussians. They just sort of basically just hate the French guts, and just sort of determined. And there's that kind of level of determination there on the other side, and skill, and also numbers, which make it harder for Napoleon. Um, so yeah, the later Napoleon is maybe less spectacularly successful than the earlier one, possibly with the exception of the campaign in France in early 1814. But there he's fighting on home soil, and he's got what military people call interior lines of communication, so it's easier for him to maneuver. And there he does have some of that kind of old flair, if you like, from his earlier years shows itself. But the Allies have got the numbers, and he hasn't by then.
One of the common criticisms that I read is that he had insufficient regard for the lives of his soldiers, and that his battle tactics led to an extremely high number of casualties, that he was kind of reckless and sloppy with the lives of his men. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think I would. And this there is this kind of very controversial meeting between Metternich and Napoleon in 1813 in Dresden, when the Austrians are trying to mediate. And it's a very long meeting, and the only record we have is Metternich's, but he kind of reports Napoleon as of having made sort of comments along the lines that he doesn't care about the lives of 100,000 or maybe a million, certainly 100,000 of his troops. It's kind of like nothing. So okay, maybe we have to be a little bit careful there, because you can't always trust Metternich. But his actions speak to that, and you get these kind of frontal assault kind of battles, like Wagram in 1809 and Borodino, and to an extent even Waterloo, which are kind of bloodbaths. And the French by this time have mastered a very efficient form of military conscription, where you can raise very large numbers of troops, and you have these sort of intakes of young men, people around 20, every year, and you can just kind of replace your losses. And one gets a sense that Napoleon can be a little bit lazy when it comes to worrying about casualties. And
That's an
you get these
interesting
kind of,
way of putting it. Yeah.
yeah, you wouldn't have been able to have done that in the 18th century, when you have these sort of small professional armies. Had
Yeah.
had you suffered losses of that scale, you wouldn't have had an army anymore, and you kind of lost a war. So you have to be more careful. You have to husband your resources. That perhaps introduces a certain caution into 18th century warfare, which in the Napoleonic period you don't really need to have. And it's you can raise perhaps 100,000 troops, annually, with an annual intake. It's and so you get this kind of war machine. I'd compare it a bit like to a tsunami. Okay, a tsunami wave is not short; it's very long. The water keeps on coming. It's deep, and this kind of conscription system that Napoleon presides over, just kind of like you just add more and more manpower to make up your losses. I think Napoleon probably overestimates what French society is capable of, and it does create a very bad mood in France, to say the least, by 1813, a degree of war weariness. And you start to get this narrative emerging that Napoleon's a kind of ogre, who imposes a blood tax upon French society, and has no problem about killing people's sons, for no purpose, and he's callous. And I think that's a very damaging, it's a damaging narrative.
Metternich is probably not gonna report on that. But did Napoleon ever show any sort of sorrow about the vast numbers of dead soldiers in his Grande Armée?
I don't think on that kind of global level, I think he could really be quite sort of callous there. So he doesn't admit, he's not very good at admitting to kind of errors or defeats, or that he was responsible for vast numbers of deaths. Whether he did, in his head, I guess we'll never know. But there's no evidence for that. And Yeah, I mean, I think he could show empathy at a personal level, and I mentioned this about Marie Louise, and there are other examples. But I think when it comes to that kind of global dealing with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of troops. Yeah, I'm sure he's sorry that he lost them, but that's because he hasn't got an army. Then in 1813, he has to create a new one. So I mean, it's geopolitically problematic if you lose 600,000 troops in one go. But you don't get a kind of like a reflection or a sense that this is a kind of like a great moral sort of problem, that it's something you should kind of reflect upon and maybe change either your policy so that there aren't those losses, or your tactics, and you do get these kind of like frontal assault type of battles, which really are bloodbaths and pretty much unprecedented, in terms of the number of losses. Maybe where 30-40% of people are casualties on one side or the other, like Borodino. Waterloo is a bit like that as well. Absolutely incredible battles.
I don't know where I read this anecdote or if it's even true. I really can't remember right now, but I read somewhere a story about Napoleon after one of his battles seeing a dead soldier and then a dog sitting behind his dead owner, who was the soldier. And then Napoleon was kind of moved by the fact that this dead soldier didn't have any of his family or friends there to mourn him. He only had this dog,
Mm.
his loyal dog there. And Napoleon kind of writes in one of his correspondence that, yeah, I can't believe that I command thousands of people to their deaths, and I'm completely cold, but I am moved now at the sight of this dog mourning his master. Is that a real story?
I don't know, but I think it is actually credible and it's plausible. But
Mm,
I've also seen stories where he sort of said, to stretcher bearers, that soldier's no good anymore. Tip him into the ditch. Try and save somebody who can actually be saved. So you get that kind of callousness as well. So I don't know what you do with those anecdotes. Do you add them
right.
up and sort of are there more humane anecdotes than not, and or is it somebody who depends on his mood? I mean, I think he is capable of showing emotion, Napoleon, and I guess we all have our mood swings, maybe, and you know pity certain things, but then can be callous in other situations. That is maybe the human condition.
Makes sense. Once he was firmly in power, what was his aim? Is it possible to ever truly discern whether he believed that he is working for the welfare of French people or just for his own glory? I suppose both can be true at the same time as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one gets a sense of Napoleon and his regime that there's a bit of a kind of like a little bit of a hole, a vacuum where there should be an idea. Something you couldn't necessarily say about Lenin or Stalin, who've got a kind of like a Marxist ideology,
Right.
or the Third Reich, I guess, we've got this kind of racial ideology. You know what the Nazi policy is basically, what their objective is. But with the Napoleonic Empire, that seems to be a bit of a bit tricky. There's a bit of this sort of ideological gap. What is the long term kind of objective? I think something which is shorter term is to simply survive. Okay, and the 1790s, you've got these multiple regime changes in France as you get constitutional monarchy, and then you get a kind of a Jacobin republic, and then a more moderate republic, which goes through various kind of sub components, and none of them last for more than a few years. So I think the immediate objective is to actually have a regime which is going to last. And then you've got this whole problem: what happens if Napoleon dies? He's assassinated, and there are quite serious attempts on his life, at various points, and that is kind of worrying, I think, for Napoleon, and it's worrying for the people around him. Does it mean that the Bourbons are going to come back, and then everything that the revolution achieved is going to be reversed? So I think the regime is struggling to legitimize itself. So that's, I think it's kind of, let's say, call it mid-term objective, is to any regime needs that. It needs to have a buy-in from a population. No regime can sustain itself simply through brute force and power. And yeah, this then becomes an issue when Josephine can't produce an heir, because the only realistic way, I think, as far as Napoleon sees it, is to have a dynasty, and to be able to pass things on to a successor who people will then accept. And Josephine can't produce an heir. Then he has this Habsburg marriage in 1810, and but it's too late. You know, the son is born in 1811. Napoleon's getting old. You're going to have a boy emperor, I guess. So then what? So it's yeah, it's an issue. Um, but you know, kind of other objectives, I think it is to bring France together, and that's maybe a positive quality about this regime. France has been basically sectarianized. You've got the Republicans, the blue, that's their kind of color, and the white, which is the royalist Catholic, and they'd been fighting a civil war in France in the 1790s, partly about religion, um, and in a way, what you're dealing with Napoleon is a centrist kind of regime, which I think from today's perspective is actually very interesting, because
Yeah.
there's a sense that society today, in much of the Western world at least, is sort of becoming kind of completely divided between two groups. We call it culture wars, I guess.
Yeah.
And that, well, I'm not saying that Napoleon is the answer to that, a kind of like a radical kind of center, but in many ways that is what he is. And he tries to bring in people from both camps. So you got people like Fouché, his infamous minister of police, who's a former Jacobin, so kind of like very much a man of the revolution. But you've also got people like Talleyrand, who is really a monarchist at heart and who has sort of grown up in the aristocratic world of the old regime, who's Napoleon's foreign minister. So he kind of says, I kind of I'll forget about what you did in the 1790s. I don't really care about that, as long as you're a talented person, you're willing to serve me loyally, and then you become part of this kind of fairly big Napoleon tent. You're brought in.
What an interesting analogy that I've never heard that before, that Napoleon was actually more of a centrist figure. I always imagined him as some sort of like a radical monarch or a radical emperor, like one or the other, but not as this like this centrist force that's actually bringing both camps together. So
Yeah,
what, the Catholics saw him as a friend to them, and also the revolutionaries saw him as sort of an ally as well? How did that work, this dynamic?
it works with a great deal of management and kind of problems attached to it. And yeah, I mean, it's partly through what politicians kind of always do, which is you speak with forked tongue. I.e., you say one thing to one kind of group of people and a slightly different thing to another group of people. And when you're in front of a sort of Catholic audience or in a Catholic part of France, you will stress your role as a restorer of religion, and you'd point to one of his greater achievements politically, which was to have that peace with the Catholic Church, the Concordat, which he signs with the Pope Pius VII, which restores a kind of religious stability to France. If you're in a more Republican area or a Republican audience, you will stress the fact that you've preserved, the essence of a revolution, equality before the law. The whole kind of property settlement, where church lands and to a degree noble lands, but mainly church lands, have been seized by the state and then auctioned off. That you're not going to reverse that. And as you can imagine, a lot of property owners in France are really worried about that one. Um, so yeah, but it's a problem. And for example, in the army, you've got a lot of Republican sentiment, including among the generals, and they really don't like that return to monarchy in 1804, and they're not very keen on the Concordat. So that creates tensions. There's a degree of tension actually about the Habsburg match in 1810. That seems to be burying the revolution. And hey, look, she's the great niece of Marie Antoinette. You seem to be back to the 1770s and 1780s. So that creates a bit of worry on the Republican side. Um, when it comes to the monarchists. They hate the fact that he bumps off the Duc d'Enghien in 1804. This kind of like figure from the French royal family who basically kidnaps and kills. So yeah, it's a bit of a balancing act. If you're a centrist, you've always got that problem of not, I guess, gravitating too much to one end or the other, and maybe becoming dependent just on one faction and alienating the other side.
So his communication skills come handy here as well.
Yeah, I think they do. Mind you, I think in many ways he's becoming more of a kind of traditional monarchist figure in many ways towards the end. And one gets his sense it becomes a bit megalomaniac. Uh, there's some really interesting architectural kind of plans for a remodeling of parts of Paris in the later Napoleonic Empire, and you start to think this looks a bit like Albert Speer's Berlin,
Right,
some of it.
Germania.
It's
Yeah.
yeah, a little bit. It's a sort of Napoleonic Germania, and they don't really come to fruition because there's no time, there's no money. It's the same story. But you think, what exactly is going on here?
How much popular support did Napoleon enjoy? It must be fluctuating, of course. But for
Hmm.
example, how did people react when he came back from the first exile? Were they greeting him on the streets, or were they pelting him with rotten eggs?
Yeah, I mean, it depends where you'd travel, and there are parts of southern France where it would have been worse than rotten eggs, I think. But he kind of avoids those sort of royalist areas on his march back to Paris. So he's not stupid. He has got a kind of like a political geography of France in his head. But other areas, yeah, he's welcomed, and
Despite the massive casualties that came from conscription, like you said.
yeah, I mean, I think that doesn't help, but people's memories are often a bit short, and the Bourbons who come back in the figure of Louis XVIII um, haven't done themselves favors. That they've started to marginalize, some Bonapartist figures, and there's a kind of problem. Ultimately the Bourbons have come back in the baggage train of the Allied armies, and that doesn't look good, I guess, from a French patriotic perspective. And they never really lived that down, that problem. It's I mean, I think Louis XVIII isn't a bad king as it happens. I mean, he's in many ways he's a bit of a centrist as well, unlike his brother, who becomes Charles X, who's a kind of like an extreme ultra royalist. And Louis XVIII, I think, realizes that France has changed after 1789, and you have to kind of rule from the middle ground, but it's really hard to do that. It's really hard to rule France from the middle ground for the next 200 years in many ways.
How did the heads of these old European royal houses view Napoleon?
It's one of those things where, again, sources become a little bit of an issue because they maybe think but don't write it down, but I think my general sense is that we underestimate the openness of Europe's elites, and that they're actually more adaptable than we give them credit for. Which is why they kind of last so long. Something which is completely static and can't bring in new people, incorporate them, is a problem. Yeah, so and I think we'll talk maybe about Ridley Scott's film a bit later, but
Yes, we will.
the Wellington character in that, I think, just it looks to be like a pantomime toff. He's it's a bit of a caricature. Maybe Wellington is a bit like that, mind you, but I don't think you can say he's a representative of the European elites as a whole. And why do I say that? Well, I think at the beginning, actually, you said that they view him with contempt. I think a lot of them actually view him as a good thing because he
Hmm.
seems to have been somebody who has actually brought order to France and has somehow tamed the revolution, possibly terminated it, but at the very least, kind of brought a kind of degree of
Stabilized.
order to
Right.
France. Yeah, and it's a kind of a recognizably monarchical regime. And maybe this is somebody who now is going to kind of like calm those revolutionary waters which have kind of lapped across the frontiers and sort of undermined our own states. So yeah, I think that is in many ways positive, and the Bonapartes start to kind of integrate themselves into the various kind of royal houses. Especially some of the German princely families. Rowe marries a German princess. That's Napoleon's youngest brother. Would be a good example of that. And we have to remember that you can't reduce European geopolitics in this period to princes versus revolution, or princes versus Napoleon. A lot of these princes have kind of problems amongst each other, and rivalries, and wars from the past, and memories, and that. And if you're a sort of minor prince in one of these German states, for example, what better thing than to take out an insurance policy by marrying a daughter to a Bonaparte? Okay, you probably marry another daughter to maybe into the Russian royal family, and even in Württemberg, for example, is connected to Britain, Napoleonic France, and Russia. So it means whoever wins, you're going to have some kind of protector, I guess, at the peace conference. So they think.
Cover all bases in a sense.
Absolutely, yeah. You got free insurance policies which kind of cover various eventualities. So that to me speaks of pragmatism. Maybe deep down they think he's a bit inferior, but the thing is that that's going to wash off after a generation. And the Bonapartes now, of course, they're not in power, but they're part of that kind of like network of European royals who you will see in sort of Hello magazine or whatever. They're kind of part of that kind of club. And it doesn't take long for them to be part of that kind of club.
You mentioned Josephine. We have to talk about her.
Mm,
I
mm,
understand we actually have quite a lot of private letters Napoleon wrote to her, less the other way around, because people say that she wasn't as smitten as he was. But there's still a lot of speculation about their relationship. And the story that's usually told is that she was the older, more experienced sort of
mm,
femme
mm.
fatale, and who wrapped this poor, smitten little man around her fingers. But what do we actually really know about their relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I always sort of see Napoleon at the beginning as this kind of like the awkward man, slightly geeky guy in the party, sort of brooding in the corner, and the high society,
Existentialist,
the
in a
the, the
way, or
social, yeah,
right.
and the socializers kind of maybe sort of laughing at this slightly geeky character who sort of is a bit awkward, and Josephine is not like that. She's the kind of like very much the inset.
The
in
soul
in
of the
this sort of.
party.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's. I mean, of course, paintings are going to be kind of very flattering, and I think she does have a bit of a tooth decay issue, which is maybe partly from her kind of heritage. She was born in the Caribbean, and I think one of the things she probably would have done is to kind of like suck on kind of sugar,
Sugar.
and
Yeah.
and that, and that sort of rots her teeth away. So yeah, I don't know how you do that if you're making a film. You'd have to get somebody to 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 kind of produce that kind of effect, I suppose. Um, so I suppose what I'm saying is, yeah, I think a lot of it is not necessarily her beauty, but her charm. And one maybe thinks of what has been written about Cleopatra. It's not necessarily that it's a physical beauty which men find attractive, but that kind of charm. And again, it's a kind of form of charisma, isn't it? Something which is difficult exactly to define, but you kind of know it when you see it, sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, he needs probably her more than she needs him initially, but she eases him into a career which very rapidly takes off. So I think that sort of power dynamic between the couple obviously changes. Yeah, I mean it's pretty clear that she is unfaithful to him, but mind you, he's not completely faithful to her. But I guess the social attitudes of the time was that it's probably okay for the man to be unfaithful more than for the woman to be
Right.
unfaithful. Um, I think she's a traumatized individual. I would say post-traumatic stress disorder. After all, she's been in effect on death row. She's seen her husband guillotined. She's barely
During the
survived this
revolution, right?
during the revolution, and I think that, to an extent, comes across in the film in Ridley Scott, and that's one of the better parts of it. I think it shows where she is coming from. And you've got this group of people, Josephine is amongst them, who can say, we've survived. We're going to live life to the full now, because there's no point really holding back, because do it while you can kind of attitude, which you get in that sort of directory, that regime, which where she's a leading social figure, but it's a regime which also has a reputation for being a little bit decadent and being perhaps promiscuous and too open, I guess, when it comes to kind of sexual politics. And this is where I think Adam Zamoyski's point about Napoleon being a bit of a prude. The Napoleonic regime, to an extent, tries to clamp down a little bit on some of that. It's for another older historical analogy, you think of Augustan Rome,
Emperor Augustus,
Augustus.
right? Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
He doesn't want this regime to look kind of promiscuous, scandal. There are ones, but they're kind of, he tries to minimize it, or hush it up or whatever. We know what happens to regimes, I guess, which get that kind of stigma of being kind of both corrupt financially but also morally. It can be politically very damaging, and history's littered with examples of regimes which to an extent collapse because of public perceptions like that.
How much power did Josephine wield as the empress, if
uh,
any?
she does have a degree of power, and we think of Napoleonic France as being this incredibly modern bureaucratic state, where appointments to senior positions is just about how good you are professionally. But yeah, I mean, she does wield a degree of influence when it comes to appointments, and you might talk about a sort of Beauharnais clan. So it becomes a little bit factionalized, elite kind of court politics in Napoleonic France, and so if you're a prefect and you've got a kind of link with the empress or with her ladies in waiting or something like that, that gives you a little bit of a kind of an advantage, all other things being equal. But she's not going to have a voice in kind of grand strategy. Do we march on Austria, or do we attack Russia at this point, or anything like that? How do we
Right,
defeat
right.
Britain? She's not going to get a voice there. I think something one has to remember is that in the late 18th century, you start to get a very negative view emerging in France and maybe further afield about women being involved in politics. And a lot of this is what Marie Antoinette becomes a victim of, that real sentiment that she is sort of manipulating things behind the scenes, manipulating her husband, Louis XVI, who is a weak ruler and allows himself to be dominated by his wife. And this becomes a kind of trope. It produces a lot of pamphlets about why you shouldn't have women in politics, and you get these sort of interesting publications, you might say bizarre, misogynist, saying uh, a history of all the women in political leadership positions since Messalina of ancient Rome, and then they kind of have all these horrible women like Catherine de Medici and that, and there's poisoners and manipulative kind of figures. So Napoleon again he's a political animal, so I think he knows what it would do to his regime. To if it's clear that he's being bossed around by his wife on policy issues, that would be a kind of catastrophic image to present in this period. But also, he's not, I guess, psychologically, he's not the kind of type of person that's going to be sort of bossed around by anyone. So certainly not when it comes to high politics.
How did she take the fact that Napoleon had to remarry and that she lost her status as the empress?
Yeah, I mean, I think she doesn't take it very well, as you can guess, and so there's this terrible scene where they go through the divorce, and I think she faints at one point, and it's really a very unpleasant, painful kind of process. I mean, beyond the actual divorce itself, which is the blow, she does, she's not sort of thrown out onto the street or anything. She gets a very big pension and a palace, probably more than one palace. And she retains her title, and you almost get a sense it's going to be more of a problem for the new empress, in that you've got this kind of ex-empress or still empress kind of like lurking there on the outskirts of Paris, who Napoleon, still has a bond with. How's that going to kind of work? It's a little bit awkward. I don't know if it's unprecedented, but history's so long and diverse, you tend to get precedents for anything. But I'm not sure if there is one for that. How do you manage that? I mean, Henry VIII, I guess I suppose no, that isn't really a precedent, is it? Maybe with Catherine of Aragon it is.
Mm.
But she's just shunted into the background in a very brutal way. Napoleon doesn't behave that way to Josephine. There is that bond, I think, of respect and affection, which continues.
Okay. After Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, would you say that France was better or worse off than it was before him?
I mean, are you asking, would it have been better had Napoleon won Waterloo and you'd have had a Bonapartist regime continuing all the way through?
No, the
Or,
state of France before Napoleon's ascension to power and the state of
yeah,
France after he was defeated, with all the casualties and all the
yeah,
reforms.
yeah,
How does it
yeah.
balance out?
I mean, I think you can look at that at a kind of institutional level, um, and then at a sort of like a political level. Institutional level, it's good. Okay, France is fit for purpose to face the rest of the 19th century and even beyond, which is, you can see that they don't really make massive institutional reforms. The departmental system, the way that France is governed and policed and taxed, and the Bank of France, and the sort of education system, the lycée, the baccalaureate,
The state
uh,
apparatus.
the state apparatus, yeah. So that's all great, and the Bourbons they keep it, and then the Orleanists they keep it, and then the Second Empire, and to an extent the Third Republic. So it kind of lasts all the way through, and a lot of it is still there today. I think politically it's a problem, and I think any regime after Napoleon in France has got a problem, partly of living up to that kind of aura of glory, of this of France being, this power which is feared and is essentially the top power in Europe, if not globally. And every regime after 1815 struggles with that, to live up to those kind of exaggerated, I would say, expectations. Um, Exaggerated partly because things are going against France at a fairly profound level. But demographically, France is kind of being outperformed by pretty much everyone else in the 19th century. So it's just its sort of economic demographic kind of weight is in decline. So the trouble is that French regimes after 1815 often have a sort of overambitious kind of foreign policy, and no more than with Napoleon III, Napoleon's nephew. That has an additional problem in that he's called Napoleon, so that gets him elected because he's got name recognition. But it also is a problem because people expect him to behave like a Napoleon, and a Napoleon doesn't just sort of have a kind of become like a giant Switzerland, okay, having a very defensive kind of Pacific foreign policy. So France overextends itself at various points, and that leads to sort of catastrophic setbacks and defeats in the 19th century. So yeah, politically really problematic, the legacy, but I wouldn't even say it's Napoleon's fault. I mean, it's there after 1789, I guess. Administratively, the kind of the operating system of the French state, yeah, that's really France is in a good place after 1815.
Because I've heard a lot of times being said that Napoleon's ultimate defeat kind of sets up the stage for Britain to take over and become this huge power empire where the sun never
Mm.
sets.
Yeah, I mean, it does kind of clear things out of the way for Britain,
Yeah.
and you get that sort of Pax Britannica in the 19th century, sort of 1815 to to I guess 1914, more or less. I suppose what I would say there is Britain is kind of that seems to be British trajectory anyway, and Britain does very well in the 18th century. You got the 7 Years' War, where it gets North America and the Indian subcontinent, and then people think, oh, it loses the 13 colonies. That Britain is going to be a kind of minor power, and the Austrian Emperor Joseph II basically writes Britain off in the early 1780s because of the loss of America. But it proves actually not to be a fundamental loss. In many ways, it isn't. And Britain has got kind of a lot of things going for it: the structure of its own state and its tax raising capacity, um, its economic kind of strength, which is based partly, of course, on the slave trade, partly on industrial development, technological development. So um, I'm wondering if Napoleon hadn't happened. I don't see that trajectory actually having changed very much, and I just don't see how Napoleon could have defeated Britain. I think it's started to move into this kind of a slightly different plane. We would call maybe industrial, whereas France is still sort of pre-industrial. So it would be like trying to defeat the United States in the mid 20th century in a way. I just don't see how it conceivably could have really been done.
A lot of historians lay this charge that Napoleon's expansionist foreign policy led to the deaths of up to 6 million people. I heard one figure, they say,
Mm,
in Europe, which admittedly is not a good look. Would you think that European states would be fighting even without Napoleon, or is this
mm.
legitimate criticism?
Yeah, I think they would be, and I mean the evidence is, that they'd been fighting all the way up to Napoleon,
Fair enough.
and and these great kind of powers. Europe is a jungle in the 18th century and probably other periods as well. And the French Revolution, you shouldn't think, okay, peace, harmony, French Revolution happens, then war. The French Revolution happens, at a time when there's a war between Russia and the Austrians versus the Ottomans, with the Swedes coming in. So, I mean, and that's not necessarily unusual. Poland gets partitioned out of existence by these old regime powers, and violence is used in these kind of processes. Yeah, let's put Napoleon into that kind of context. I think where the case for the prosecution against Napoleon would be that, yeah, his wars are then particularly bloody. Um, Part of that is because of French state before Napoleon starts to invent a form of conscription, which means you can produce much bigger armies, and then everyone else has to respond. So even there, without Napoleon, you'd have had bigger European armies fighting bloodier battles. So even if he's personally not around to make any decisions, that would have been the case. But yeah, I think he maxes out that kind of that kind of losing lots of
Fighting style.
soldiers. Yeah,
Right, right.
and I think Europe as a whole is kind of shocked and war weary after 1815. And I think what is interesting is that you don't really get a major European war for a very long time after 1815. So 1815 ends a sequence which doesn't start in 1792, but starts way earlier. I don't know how far back you need to go, but then you get this period where, if you like, European aggressive impulses are sort of directed outwards, to places like Algeria, I guess, after 1830, and to overseas. And then you get the Crimean War, but that's a bit on the periphery, and it's not a global, not really a global conflict. I mean, there's some fighting in the Pacific even there, but it's not massive, okay, compared to the Napoleonic Wars. And then you get these short wars in the 1860s about German Italian unification, 1870, 71. The real next massive war involving everyone, basically, who's important, is 1914 to 1918. So you get a century of relative peace in Europe, and that is unusual.
I wanted to ask you this before we start discussing the movie. Would you agree that in a way Napoleon will always remain a bit of an uh, open vessel, in the sense that our evaluation of him also depends on our vantage point? For example, in Britain, quite understandably, he's always been a bit of a boogeyman. and
mm,
comparisons to Hitler sometimes can still be heard. On the other hand, I come from a place where Napoleon is remembered as, well, pretty much one of the good lads. Like, I'm originally Slovenian, and in Ljubljana, our
mm,
capital city, we have, I believe, the only monument to Napoleon outside of France, or one of the only ones. And it wasn't put there by him or the French, but by us. More than 100 years after his death, it's actually really close to my parents' house.
mm, mm,
It's quite awesome. It's an obelisk. Now, during his campaigns, Napoleon, of course, tore these lands from Austria and called them Illyrian provinces. But
mm,
what
mm,
his rule was really kind of remembered for was a whole set of liberating new rights for the majority of the populace, liberating for the times, of course, and as well as the fact that for the first time, Slovenian language became an official language in Slovenian lands, which was a big deal. Anyway, once these reforms were implemented, the Austrians couldn't just roll them back once they took over again. So they had a profound and lasting effect in the collective memory. So in our high school history class, we probably hear something else about Napoleon than what an English teenager would hear in
mm.
theirs.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I kind of straddle both camps in that, part of my family background is British, so I guess they would have probably hated Napoleon going back to that period. And I don't know if they fought against him or not, but some of them must have done, I guess. But part of my background is from the Rhineland, that's a western part of Germany, where again Napoleon was seen much more positively, and rather like in Slovenia, a lot of those institutions, like the civil code, that they're admired and respected, and they don't like the Prussians trying to come in and sort of change that. So I kind of see both sides of that argument. I mean, I think on the British side, it's sad to say, I think that there's a great deal of neglect, and that's an even bigger insult, if you will. If it's not only you not ridiculed or criticized or condemned, but you're kind of ignored, and so it's not a huge part, I think, of the curriculum. I don't get the sense that by by children, daughters there in that kind of age going through the school system. They haven't really had much exposure to Napoleon, um, so he's kind of ignored. Yeah, I mean, there were people in Britain at the time that sort of admire Napoleon. He's this great kind of romantic figure, and I think what helps Napoleon in that period is that a lot of the other governments, especially after 1815, become very reactionary and repressive, and that happens in Britain as well. And then Napoleon is seen as somebody who's a disruptor. Um, but yeah, I mean, every generation, I guess, looks at Napoleon in a slightly different way, and now with things like Black Lives Matter, debates about slavery, Napoleon doesn't look quite as good.
Right.
He
The
does
Haiti affair.
reintroduce, yeah, that, and the reintroduction of slavery, or partial reintroduction. So there's a lot of debate there about Napoleon and his sort of interaction with the world outside of Europe. Is he a kind of like a European imperialist, and is he a racist? Those kind of questions. Is he, what about women, other minority groups? And it's a bit of a mixed bag, when it comes to uh, Jews, for example. Yeah, I mean, he opens up ghettos in places like Rome, and it does seem to be a tolerant regime when it comes to religion. When it comes to things like homosexuality, it's relatively tolerant. So these are the kind of questions which are being asked by students now. That's on the agenda, and you didn't really have very much reflection about these things when it came to Napoleon in the past, when there were other debates, going on. And I don't know, in 10, 20 years time, where the debates will be then. And I think in many ways the ambiguities and complexities of a Napoleonic regime, which reflect the ambiguities and complexities of a world which is transitioning from the early modern, from a kind of very hierarchical structure about bloodlines and established religions, to the world we are kind of used to today. It's a very complex transition, and we're still debating, I think, those complexities, some of them. What are the hierarchies? What are appropriate hierarchies? Should there be any hierarchies? How do we manage power imbalances? All of that kind of stuff. Well, if you want a lesson on how that works and comes into being in our modern period, well, look at the Napoleonic period.
Last but not least, time is pressing, so we have to talk about Ridley Scott's film, which already managed to ruffle some feathers, particularly in France, where the critics have labeled the film as very pro British and very anti French. On top of this, the movie has been panned for its many historical inaccuracies. You've seen the film. What did you think of it?
Yeah, I have to admit, I really didn't like it, and I wished I'd have been next door watching kind of Hunger Games 4, I think, which was
Wow.
where the
Okay, you came out
where
guns
where,
blazing.
yeah, my daughter
Interesting.
was watching that with her friend. I thought, okay, I didn't like it. I didn't think actually the British came across that positively. I mean, they came across as I mentioned, as like pantomime tough kind of figures. I thought profoundly unsympathetic in a way, and I didn't like it. I think for a couple of reasons, and one actually is less to do about historical inaccuracy or not, but it was I just thought it was a little bit too ambitious in trying to cover 30 years of his life. So I thought technically that wasn't great in that you just had these kind of like fragments, these episodes going from 1793 to Napoleon's death in 1821. And I think I would have liked to have seen a film which was maybe a little bit more focused and allowed the characters to develop more. So that's almost looking at the film as a non-Napoleonic specialist, as somebody that's actually I quite like kind of
Historical
film
epics.
biographies. Yeah, I do
Yeah.
like them. I should admit I didn't like Gladiator very much, which was Ridley Scott as well.
Okay. I love that
Uh,
movie. Full disclosure.
but I really do like Ridley Scott's The Duelist, which
Yeah.
is a
Yeah.
lesser well known film, 19, which is I think his first major film. Which, if you want something which captures the kind of essence of the Napoleonic period, I'd recommend to everyone to watch The Duelist. It's based on a true story as well, which
It's
is
these
great.
two duelists that meet every 10 years, right?
Yeah, or
And then
every
they
few
duel
years.
again
Yeah,
every few years or whatever. Right, right. Yeah, it's a
these kind of
fantastic film.
obsessives,
Yeah.
when it comes to this cult of honor, which I think infuses Napoleonic. So Ridley Scott knows about the period; he can do the period, but yeah. So I didn't like the way the film was structured, and then I just think it doesn't get the feel right of the period. And yeah, I'm not necessarily a stickler for historical accuracy because I think there's something called artistic license, and you can sometimes take liberties with facts, but then you do speak to a wider or bigger truth, so you can do that. But why have French artillery shell the pyramids? It's
Because it's
kind
a
of a
good
stupid.
shot. It
It's a good
looks
shot, but
amazing.
why do that? Because there's so many amazing things you could have done drawing on what actually happens in the Napoleonic period without doing things like that. I thought those kind of sex scenes with Josephine a bit bizarre. I don't that didn't seem to ring true to me. And this under a dining room table with kind of servants present. I don't think so. Those things just didn't feel kind of authentic to me and were a bit mildly off-putting. I had a bit of a problem. I mean, I like Joaquin Phoenix a lot. I think he's a good actor, but he did seem to me a bit. Well, it's not only old for the role, and of course, remember, Josephine is about 6 years older than Napoleon, whereas when you look at the actors in the film, it's more than reversed. So, is there a bit of a casting issue there? And Napoleon never seems to age. I mean, it's just his kind of like uniform and hat changes a bit, and maybe even worse, he doesn't seem to develop much as a character. I would have liked to have seen more of that. I wouldn't join the French in saying, "Oh, it's just kind of like pro-British," because I think it's in many ways it's just a technically a bit of a disappointing film. I thought, and
Mm.
yeah, I'm sure they see it as just like kind of Gilray and Cruikshank, another Anglo-Saxon kind of whacking the French kind of part of that genre, which I don't think is what Ridley Scott. I don't think the French do they appear that bad. I didn't get. I
I
mean, I think
think,
Napoleon appears bad, but
yeah.
yeah.
Well, this is how Ridley Scott responded to the criticisms about historical accuracy. I do apologize for the profanity, but these are my friend Ridley's words, not mine. He said the
Mm,
following: When I have issues with historians, I ask, "Excuse me, mate, were you there? No? Well, shut the fuck up
mm,
then." I
mm.
mean, that is quite an amusing response.
Yeah.
Not very articulated, but we can't deny that the man's passion is there for the film at least.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a good thing. I mean, that's good. And as I say, I respect his knowledge of that period in the field because I've seen The Duelist, which, as I say, is up there with films like Danton, the early 1980s, which I think really captures the sort of terror. So he can do it, but I'm not sure. Well, he says that historians weren't there. I'm glad I wasn't there during those kind of scenes with Napoleon and Josephine getting intimate. um, and of course, yeah, I mean, historians weren't there, but they do read people that were.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah, I mean, it's not a
there's very
serious argument.
it's not serious. And as I say, I mean, I'm not particularly worried if the coronation it was longer than a few minutes, which is how it's portrayed as. But the idea that Napoleon kind of crowns himself, and he does say not during the ceremony, but in another context, he picked the crown out of a gutter. I think that was fair. It's good artistic license. It's visually, but it actually gets the essence right. That scene and.
What about the
Um,
battle scenes? What did you think of those?
um, kind of okay, but again, one measures it with other films, and a film I really like is Waterloo, 1970, and I've forgotten the director's name. I think a Ukrainian
I haven't seen
director,
it.
and Rod Steiger plays Napoleon in that, and Christopher Plummer is Wellington. Basically, the whole film, or most of the film, is devoted to the Battle of Waterloo, and that is filmed using, I think, a large number of extras are actually provided by the Soviet army, believe it or not, including authentic cavalry units. And those battle scenes are absolutely amazing. They've got that kind of scale, that grandeur, but they also somehow haven't got that AI generated kind of look about them. Now, I don't know to what extent that was used in Ridley Scott. So, yeah, kind of okay, but there are a lot of them, and yeah, there are inaccuracies in some of those too. I think Waterloo is. I had the pleasure of actually visiting the battlefield earlier in the year, and Wellington is very good at using the reverse slope, so he kind of like concentrates most of his army behind a slope, so you can't see it. That wasn't done in the film. So yeah, I mean, you make of that of what you will.
What about the ice lake scene? That was not a real thing, was it?
It wasn't, but I think something like that happens either at Eylau or Friedland, which is
I see.
1807.
Okay.
So,
So there is
where
some authenticity
where
to that.
you do get some Napoleonic battles where people kind of fall into freezing water, and,
Mm.
and the French retreat at Berezina is like that. So, fair enough. I would say that's within the parameters of artistic license. And I mean, what is good is it shows the real horrors of war, and it shows you the heroism, but also the bloodshed. And I think that is for me a more interesting balance to kind of strike, because yeah, we live in an age which is uh, it has a very low kind of tolerance threshold for that kind of thing. But on the other hand, at the time, you did have this kind of cult of glory and heroism. And I think you have to kind of recognize that. And I think the film brings that out. And yeah, the uniforms are spectacular, and the cavalry. What I don't like about some of the older films is I'm sure a lot of horses die in making some of those early, crippled, and I'm sure that these days that kind of authenticity isn't allowed. Ethically wouldn't be approved, and thank God for that.
One of the main problems I had with the film was that Joaquin Phoenix's choice to portray him as this kind of almost a boring little average Joe or something who's devoid of any charisma and who just happens to be good at fighting. And I love Joaquin Phoenix. Usually, he's one of
Mm,
my
mm,
favorite actors. So that was
mm,
a choice that he made, an artistic choice they made with the director probably.
mm,
But I have
mm.
trouble believing that if Napoleon was this sort of almost like a drab apparatchik or something, hundreds of thousands would follow him to the ends of the earth, literally. Like
Yeah,
it didn't seem credible.
yeah. That was that I thought as well. Why would people in large numbers follow him, as you say, to the ends of the earth, and sacrifice themselves, willingly? And you get this, there's a degree of memoir literature and letters and correspondence that survives from the Napoleonic army, and you get these kind of like comments, we loved our marshals, but the emperor we worshipped as a god, and those kind of like things. And yeah, I couldn't worship that Napoleon which we were exposed to over the last few days. As you say, he's a bit weird in certain ways, and not in a positive sense. I think, yeah, if I were Napoleon, I would not like that film myself, because it, everyone is a balance, I guess, of negative and positive kind of characteristics are seen by outsiders, and I think there was a little bit too much on the negative, and maybe the positive maybe not enough there. So
Hmm.
maybe I'd be a little bit with the French on that part, yeah, of their criticism.
In the film, he's quite humorless, and I wanted to ask you this before. Did Napoleon have a sense of humor?
I think you could do sarcasm, if you call that. It's the lowest form of
I
humor,
do,
isn't
yeah.
it? They say,
Okay, it is
yeah.
a form of humor. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that calling Talleyrand a pile of shit in silk stockings is pretty cool, because I think he does to an extent sum him up. That kind of elegance, but inside he can be a bit shitty and a bit
That's pretty awesome, to
yeah.
be honest. We can take that box.
Normally Talleyrand was quite good at kind of those kind of insults as well. He's bon mot,
Hmm.
then he got outgunned on that particular occasion.
Last question. Did Napoleon suffer from the Napoleon complex?
um, Go into that kind of psycho history type of thing, and he was bullied as a cadet and made fun of because he was short and had a
Was he
funny
really
Corsican
short? You
accent.
said that he was a little bit below average height, but
Yeah,
I
I
thought
mean,
that this has
with
been debunked over and over again. So I
yeah,
wanted to
I
ask you.
think, and I don't know. I'm sure we'll get response. I think he was 5'7", but and you look at world leaders today in relative terms. Well, people have actually commented on Macron. I guess
Yeah.
he wouldn't stand out. I don't think as being somebody who people would kind of like stare at. I mean, I think part of this is British propaganda at the time. Gilray and Cruikshank. It's a great period. That's Napoleon's great misfortune, I guess, to coincide with this great tradition of British cartoonism, and they portray him as kind of like midget, this mosquito-sized kind of object, kind of poking John Bull, who's this huge character, and so I think that's part of it. So yeah, there might be something going on there that he's just kind of had to always kind of fight his way through his sort of siblings and his older brother and assert himself, and but how do we know? It's nature nurture kind of debate, isn't it? I mean,
Hmm.
I don't know if it's been proven one way or the other. I suppose that the tragedy from Napoleon's point of view is that those were the things which got him to the top.
Yeah.
You could have made it to the top without having those kind of qualities, but they're also the things which get him from the top back down to the bottom.
Hmm.
He just can't be integrated into some kind of stable order, which is polycentric, a kind of what Europe is, a variety of great powers, and no one is ever going to dominate everyone else for a long time. So that's a that makes him a kind of tragic figure, I guess. Somebody who's bound to fall at the end. That maybe could have been brought out a little bit more, actually. That sort of tragedy.
What a great way to wrap up the conversation, Michael. Thank you. Where can people follow your work? Do you have any social media?
I'm a bit neglectful of that.
Okay.
So, I mean, the best thing is just to look me up on King's College London webpage, and yeah, and LinkedIn. I'm afraid it's those sort of more boring academic kind of areas. But yeah, yeah, if you type in, I guess, Michael Rowe on YouTube, I've done a few kind of casts. I did a recording with the BBC in our time with Melvin Bragg, which discusses the invasion of Russia, that kind of climactic episode, along with a couple of other historians. So yeah, uh,
Yeah,
that's where you'll
unfortunately,
find
we
me.
couldn't talk about that, but maybe next time, if you're up to it, I would be super grateful
Great.
if we can do
Well,
this again. You're such a wealth of knowledge. It's such a privilege to have this conversation. It was absolutely splendid. Thank you so much.
Zaza, thanks for those kind words and for putting this together.
Hey, thank you for listening. First and foremost, a massive, massive thank you to my producers, Lorenzo, Jurechuk, Carmen, Veronica, Mila, and Taichi. You legends rock. Without you, this podcast would not have been possible at all. Thank you so much. For the rest of you, if you enjoyed listening to the episode, please follow and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And of course, if you'd like to become a patron as well, go to Patreon, type Smart Cookies in there, and become one. All right. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.